Joined now as we are on Tuesdays from the province and Post Media, Mr. Patrick Johnston. We find him in the nation's capital where he's planning a coup. How are you?
Wow. Man, I didn't know we were going to talk about that today.
Well, you never talk about coups until you execute coups.
That's true. That's
what takes you out east? What,
you want to talk about coups? Is that what?
Why would you leave beautiful British Columbia in late July, Patrick? That's the best time of year out here.
I heard it's raining, Matt. So why would I?
Yeah,
want
it
to
is. It is.
Just family vacation. Have a nice time.
Okay.
Dump the kids at the in-laws' cottage, and now I'm up in Ottawa visiting an old friend and enjoying It's very nice. The weather's very nice here, Matt. You'd love it here. You'd be very happy here on this day.
Yeah, stifling humidity, as I recall. Hey, just before we get into the Canucks and Cup contention, our theme of the week, our Bodog poll question, I saw you wrote on Derek Clancey last week, leaving the Canucks for a lateral position to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Was it just a money thing, Patrick, or were you able to suss out whether there was something else at play with Derek Clancy, who seemed like a very trusted right hand, the first hire of Jim Rutherford and the guy who actually had experience in his role, which cannot be said about a lot of the other Canucks execs.
Yeah, certainly in the early stages, a very important hire for Jim Rutherford, who essentially inherited a nearly bare front office. He had Stan Smeel and Ryan Johnston essentially after Jim Benning and John Weisbro were let go, and then ownership decided to get rid of Chris Gear and Jonathan Wall. There just was not a whole lot. I mean, first of all, institutional knowledge, and then there was just not a lot of people there at all with any kind of, they had the analytics team, but that sort of trusted high-end, staffing, they just didn't have it. So Clancy was really important. It was interesting going back and looking at the way we covered the hiring, what Rutherford told us at that time. He was literally like, I need someone to tell me about hockey players, basically. And Clancy had been with the Penguins when he was there, left essentially after, as far as I could tell, after Rutherford decided to go, that Brett Clancy didn't want to stick around. Had found a landing spot in Calgary with Brad Trelivings, who has now hired him in Toronto, of course. But yeah, a trusted voice, a guy that clearly was very involved in some scouting aspects. We saw him in the recent Canucks behind the scenes draft video as essentially being the guy that really said, Willander, I'm not sure he'll be there at 13, which, I think if you parse it, you're not sure that was actually true, but certainly put his foot down and said, this is where we should draft. If we really want this guy, we don't want to risk it. There were a lot of people. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. There's a lot of cooks in that kitchen. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But it did feel at times, especially once they really did fill out their roster of AGMs just over a year ago, Cammy Granato was described as being in charge of scouting, and we'd been told that Derek Clancey was in charge of scouting. So, there clearly was overlap there in terms of responsibility. So what are you being asked to do? What are you being tasked? I mean, Toronto's already got a full stable of people in front office. I mean, Lawrence Gilman now just runs the Marlies and is not in the NHL front office, but there are already a couple AGMs there. So what role is he going to fill? Is he simply just a very, very well-paid super scout? I mean, that is possible. Money, I'm sure, is involved. I mean, that was part of the reason I think Manuel Holtra went to Toronto, was that there was just a great offer on the table to join a team that was trying to go places, going into a season that was going to be difficult for everyone. I think it's probably, it feels like to me there was a number of things at play. It was interesting to me that, when they made the announcement essentially that he was jumping the gun a little bit on the Leafs, when I went back to the Canucks and said, listen, this is Jim's first hire. Can we perhaps add a little more here? Could I talk, that Rutherford actually offered up a bit of his comment on it. I thought that was interesting that they did recognize that we all saw this as significant, and then saying, no, we'll be fine. We're going to be, and hey, credit. Maybe it's in the end credit to the people that they have in place that Cameron Granado, who hadn't done a lot of hockey management when she'd hired. She'd worked as a pro scout, but certainly to me speaks to the importance they place on her role in scouting. And, in the end, you try out a certain setup. And, I suppose we could say they're simply moving on and saying, we have enough here and we don't need to do any replacements.
And Patrick, speaking of draft picks, and certainly on the amateur side of things, we were talking yesterday, we're theming our week here on cup contention, what it will take for the Canucks to be a cup contender, and could they already have been a cup contender? It was 9 or 8 different draft picks, first or second rounders, that went out the door between 2015 and this past draft, where, of course, 2 of them, a first and a second, went out the door for Philip Hronek. If they keep the entirety of that lot and pick guys and develop them, what do you think? How much closer are they to being a cup contender at this stage of the game?
Massively closer. I mean, that was one of the conclusions I drew from that 5 draft review series that I did going into the recent draft. Just looking at the types of players, one of the questions we asked was not just who did they get with the picks, but who else were options. We look at the evolution of the draft and how much better teams are. Everybody is. You look back 20 years ago, there were plenty of guys that you could find in the later rounds that proved to be much better than they were drafted at. Now it's very much about first and second round picks are the driving players on your team, and the rest are unique players, and you will find serviceable NHLers, but you're not finding any stars. And you look at, obviously everyone likes to talk about Dylan Guenther as such a recent example, but you look at, say, Rasmus Andersson. Sven Mirchi was a very useful player for the Canucks for a couple of years, but in the long run, it is hard to argue against having a guy like Rasmus Andersson in the lineup. And those are the kinds of players. I mean, even the recent run, you look at Niels Höglander. Like, there's a guy that's a handy, potentially still. I mean, obviously still has to work out, but has shown enough that I think he will be a handy NHLer. And even, as a sort of a minimum standard player, like that is the minimum type player that you're going to find in the second round. And going back over the past decade, the Canucks simply have not, or since 2010 even, the Canucks simply have not drafted enough in the second round, no matter the regime, to really build that sort of sustainable mid-tier player, the kind of player that you see, for instance, in Tampa. This, again, goes back to the story that it's not just about drafting anymore, it's about developing. And the kind of mid-tier player that Tampa has been so good at building into being useful players that in the end help drive your sort of the consistency of your competitiveness at all times. And I think there's just absolutely no argument that otherwise, that the Canucks have been foolish in the number of second round picks certainly they've given away, and it would be a very different story today if they had kept more of those.
Pat, the Canucks have gone pretty quiet, as have most teams now. We're through that first wave of NHL free agency. There's still some names out there. I think a lot of people, though, forget that the Canucks are still $4 million above the salary cap limit. Now, they can be there and exist there in the summer months, but do you think long-term injury is their way out of this, or are we going to get back to a point where the volume will be raised about trading Garland and Besser or whoever to be cap
certainly
compliant?
That was, I think, what raised our eyebrows when we talked to Patrick Allvin after the first day of free agency there about his statements about Tanner Pearson's status. Now, whether that was simply positioning, in terms of you can't just, we expect he won't be. I mean, I guess you have to say he won't be available. That's what was also so telling when he spoke about Tucker Pullman, which I don't think surprised us. You look at those two guys who combine for $5+ million in cap hit. And if those two are unable to play, they're actually, quote unquote, under the cap. I mean, technically, let's remember that LTI doesn't mean you're actually under the cap. You just have cap space. Yeah. Not just semantics. I mean, it really is how the math works. That is, I think, in the back pocket. You still wonder about whether they have some dream of flipping, another guy or two. When push comes to shove, are they sitting there hoping that, you go into training camp probably with more guys than you plan to have to start the season? You're going to have to make some move. You need to see what happens in terms of injuries, whether that's on your own roster or that's another team. I do feel like that is also kind of, I feel that's where they're at. Obviously they have the LTIR question in the back of their minds. But I think it really is one of those ones. There are always going to be changes to people's plans over the course of preseason. And, I think the Canucks are sort of saying, okay, well, at least at that point, we'll make a Riley Stillman type trade, that kind of move. There are always moves to be made. I don't know if that's the most optimal way about going about things, but certainly they have to make a choice. I mean, this is something we've talked about, I feel like, every week. They're going to as it stands, they're going to have to make some decisions. The first one was buying out OEL, but they still have to make some other decisions because at the end of the day that that they are going to be over the cap, as you said.
As we look back, and it's been a month since the OEL buyout, did you think that the OEL buyout was the first of a multi-step plan? Are you a little surprised that there weren't other dominoes that fell there?
Good question. There were some dominoes. They got some new players. They used the money that was going to go to OEL and signed, a trio, however you want to count, several players. In the back of my mind, I still wonder if there's a trade. I mean, we've talked so much about it. I think we know they were trying to make stuff happen at the deadline. There obviously were some talks. They were not cap type trade talks at draft. We know that there certainly were in consideration. I think it was Buffalo, and Cam Robinson said was it Arizona as well? No, not Arizona. Nashville.
Nashville.
I believe there was actually another one out there, but anyway, they were pretty steadfast that was the pick they were going to make, and I think they made lots of calls. I think they took lots of calls, but as it stands, I mean, they've turned over a large portion of the roster. I think they've been wanting, they've wanted to move. I've said this so many times. I'm sure people are tired of hearing about it. Tyler Myers was a guy they recognized very early on with this new regime was a guy that they would prefer to have on another team. And he had it, but he had a difficult year, and that's a difficult one to move, at least right now. I mean, maybe when his bonus is paid out in September, as I think we think it is, maybe that changes the dynamic. I'm still in that kind of wait and see, because I think I mentioned this last week, and Jeff, it was your point, the fact that sort of the draft, the reviews after the free agency there from everybody was sort of nonplussed about what the Canucks did, neither negative nor positive, in a very competitive division. And this goes back to how long will they be a contender? I mean, JT Miller, I think I like JT Miller as a player. I don't think he is a guy that really pushes the meter in a two-way sense. Obviously, certainly not a Patrice Bergeron type player, but that, a powerful two-way second line center, is what this team needs. And that's just not JT Miller. He's got a very handy set of offensive tools, but just as a defensive player, we've seen it. It was exposed more than once on this season. And, I think that continues to be the sort of roster building that is required here continues to be something I think we all stare at. And it goes back to exactly what you said. If you're going to move on from OEL, what are you replacing him with? Well, they've replaced him with players that are probably more competent and more stable, but certainly nothing closer to sort of that star power that you're really going to need if you're going to be a contender.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you say that, echoing the welcome, Matt, that, and I'll ask you the Bodog poll question here in a second about how many pieces away they are from cup contention, but JT Miller as a winger and as your emergency top six center, I think is a better place for him to be for a lot of reasons. And I love the question Jeff asked you on two fronts, because if you were going to go to the extreme of Oliver Ekman-Larsson buyout, and it is one of the biggest buyouts in the history of the National Hockey League, you turned around and immediately spent it on three role players. And unless Carson Soucy has a great year 2 and great year 3, you haven't really bought any future contribution to the hockey team with that buyout, which could be a little bit concerning. I mean, it smacks of the sort of moves that the previous regime did, money burning a hole, cap space burning a hole in my pocket, go out, try and fill some immediate needs with shorter term options, which, and this is, their marching orders are to make the playoffs. So I can understand why Rutherford and Alvin would operate that way, because at the end of the day, we all have bosses. But, I do wonder whether it was sort of a nearer sighted way of spending that cap space. The reality is,
and this is not necessarily justification, but the reality is that this is how most GMs understand what they're after. They're after the here and now. And so it's about the bets that you make right now. And I would say that is a difference here compared to the betting era, that the bets on a guy like Sosi especially is that it's just a better bet than betting on Jay Beagle or, Antoine Roussel. I thought was an interesting bet, but in the end, that was going to take a lot for that one to work out. Louis Eriksson was coming off essentially a career, so I think second best shooting percentage of his career, aging into his 30s. It was a long contract that was going to be, even when he signed, was going to be difficult. But even in the short term, was this really a game breaker? They've at least avoided that kind of deal. Sosi, I think, is interesting. Cole, obviously is in his 30s, but there's not a huge commitment there. It's a player that, you are asking to say, listen, you've been pretty handy, pretty useful. Obviously, in the back of their minds, they remember how well he played in their Stanley Cup years, and he is now in his 30s, and he was in his sort of mid to late 20s then. And then that does make a difference, especially for a defenseman. So that, to me, that is the difference. But in the end, like you said, these are role players, and the role players help you sort of tread water, but it's the star players that really matter. And go back to every single team that was in the Final Four last year, and those are teams that are filled with star power, and the Canucks have some star power. I'm just not convinced they have enough.
Yeah. Okay, Bodog poll question time. How many pieces are they away from Cup contention? 2, 3, 4, or go off the board?
I think it's 2. I really do. I think it's, like I said, it's that center. It's that second line center, that guy that's not necessarily as good as Elias Pettersson, but a guy that is, Ryan O'Reilly is an outstanding player, but he has been a first line center, but at this stage in his career, he's more of a second or a third. But that kind of depth center who helps push the meter when he's on the ice, they definitely need that. And clearly, obviously they're betting on Philip Hronek to be that 1A kind of guy. I'm more of the thing he's at number 3, number 4 on a truly great team. So it's finding another guy to really anchor a second pairing, a guy that is a sort of masterful two-way player. You look at the Boston Bruins, right? They picked up Hampus Lindholm, and people knew he was still a good player, but rejuvenated himself in a lineup that was full of things and was a guy in consideration for the Norris because of the way he was set up. And finding a guy like that who is a two-way force, to me, is just the other thing this team really needs. And we'll see. Maybe Hronek is that guy, but I'm not sure he is, given just the skill sets we know he has from Detroit.
Yeah. Marvelous stuff. You were free to have a Ottawa afternoon and evening. Hey, go find yourself a bar tomorrow downtown for the women's match. At the FIFA World Cup, because there's a lot of people who bleed red and white in that town. So.
All right, boys.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick. Enjoy your holiday. We'll talk to you next Tuesday. Mm-hmm. This is a Carson Price clip brought to you by Bodog. Make a play at Canada's choice for free casino games, sports odds, and poker strategies.